Chet Baker had a son he barely knew. This was not a secret and was not, by the standards of Baker's life, an unusual circumstance. His marriage to Helema had produced the boy in 1955 and had dissolved shortly afterward, and the combination of Baker's touring schedule, his European exile, and the general organizational chaos of his personal life had created a distance between father and son that was measured not just in miles but in the accumulated weight of absences that had no individual justification and no collective remedy. The son grew up in Los Angeles knowing his father's name and his father's music and very little of his father. When the hospital called Helema and Helema called Copenhagen, the distance between Baker and the boy in the hospital bed was the largest it had ever been. What Baker did that night made it larger, and what Baker did for the rest of his life was try, imperfectly and incompletely, to account for it. The year was 1961. Baker was 31 years old and 14 months out of the Lucca prison, which had taken him out of circulation for most of 1959 and 1960 and which had left him, on release, with a damaged embouchure and a European career that had to be rebuilt from zero. The rebuilding had gone better than anyone had predicted. René Lepine had booked him across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in the months following the release, and the quality of the playing had surprised the jazz world sufficiently to generate a momentum that Baker had been sustaining through 1961 with the focused energy of someone who understands that the window for a second chance is not indefinitely open. The European circuit that Baker was working in 1961 was, by the standards of what he had known in America, intimate and serious. The clubs were smaller, the audiences were more attentive, the promoters were less interested in the commercial calculations that had always characterized his American bookings and more interested in the music itself, which suited Baker in a way that the American market never quite had. He was not famous in Europe in the way that he had briefly been famous in America. He was known, respected, and sought after by the specific community of people who took jazz seriously, which was a more sustainable form of professional life than the broader celebrity that the Chet Baker Sings cover photograph had generated and that the Italian imprisonment had effectively ended. Baker was building something smaller and more durable than what he had lost, and he was building it with the patient attention of someone who has learned, at some cost, the difference between the two. The Copenhagen engagement was part of that momentum. The club was the Montmartre Jazzhaus, which was one of the most respected jazz venues in Scandinavia and which booked American musicians with the selectivity of an institution that could afford to choose. Baker had been booked for 4 nights, which was a significant commitment from a venue that did not make significant commitments lightly, and the first 2 nights had gone well enough that the club's owner, a Danish man named Carl Knudsen, who had been presenting jazz for 15 years, had mentioned to Lepine that he was interested in booking Baker again the following year. Baker was in the backstage corridor of the Montmartre on the 3rd night, 40 minutes before the set, when Carl Knudsen found him and told him there was a phone call. International calls to musicians on tour were not routine in 1961. The logistics were complicated and the cost was significant, which meant that when a call came through to a venue, it was almost always something that could not wait for the musician to return home. Baker took the phone from Knudsen's hand and heard Helema's voice. Helema spoke carefully and briefly, in the way of someone who has rehearsed what she is going to say because she knows the person she is saying it to will not make it easy. She told Baker that their son, 6 years old, living in Los Angeles with Helema and her family, had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier with a fever that had become something more serious. The doctors were managing it. The prognosis was not alarming, but was not clear. She was telling Baker because she thought he should know. She did not ask him to come. She had learned, over the years, since the marriage had ended, not to ask Baker for things that the distance and the touring and the particular organization of his life made difficult to provide. She was not, in other words, naive about what she was dealing with. She had organized her life and her son's life around the reliable absence of Chet Baker with the pragmatic thoroughness of a woman who had understood early that waiting for Baker to become someone he was not built to be was not a productive use of the time available. She told him what was happening, gave him the hospital's number, and waited. Baker listened to all of this without speaking. When Helema finished, he said, "I'll call the hospital." Helema gave him the number. Baker wrote it down on a piece of paper that Carl Knudsen handed him. Then he said, "How bad is it really?" Helema said, "Bad enough that I called." Baker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll call tonight, after the set." Helema said nothing. Baker said, "I'm on in 40 minutes. Helema said, "I know." There was a silence between them that carried the weight of everything that had accumulated in the 6 years since the marriage had ended and the boy had been born into the specific circumstances that Baker's life created. Then Helema said, "Call tonight," and she hung up. Knudsen's assistant had overheard enough of the conversation to understand its general shape, and within 20 minutes of the call had found a midnight flight from Copenhagen to Los Angeles with a connection in London. He had written the details on a second piece of paper and placed it in Baker's hand in the corridor. Baker looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that Knudsen, who was standing nearby with the careful attention of a venue owner who has just realized that his third night booking has developed a complication, began to understand that the decision being made in that corridor was not a simple one. The flight cost significantly more than Baker had available. Knudsen had offered to cover it within 5 minutes of understanding the situation, with the straightforward generosity of a man who respected Baker's music enough to want to help the person who made it. The club had offered to release Baker from the fourth night's engagement without penalty. Le Pen, reached by phone in Paris, had said, "You should go." There was no practical obstacle that had not been removed or offered to be removed. The only thing left was Baker's decision. Baker set the piece of paper with the flight details on the corridor table. He picked up his trumpet. He walked toward the stage. Nobody stopped him. This was partly because nobody in that corridor knew what to say to a man who had just made a decision they did not fully understand, and partly because Baker's movement toward the stage had the quality that his movement always had: unhurried, deliberate, carrying the specific gravity of someone who has decided something and is done with the deciding. Knudsen watched him go and did not call after him. The assistant with the flight information looked at Le Pen's number on his notepad and did not dial it. The set Baker played that night was, by the accounts of everyone present, the finest of the 4-night engagement and one of the finest of his European period. The Montmartre was full. The third night had sold out on the strength of the first two. And the Danish jazz audience, which brought to live performance the same quality of focused, attentive silence that Scandinavian audiences consistently offered American musicians, received Baker with the complete attention that his playing required and rarely received on the American circuit. Baker played for 90 minutes without a break, which was unusual. He typically structured his sets with pauses between songs and occasional short intervals. The rhythm section, a Danish pianist named Erik Moseholm and a Swedish bassist who had been assembled by Knudsen for the engagement, said afterward that Baker on that third night was playing in a way they had not experienced in the previous 2 nights, not technically different, but with a quality of absolute presence, of total commitment to each phrase, that made the usual distinction between a musician performing and a musician expressing something personal collapse entirely. Moseholm said, "I don't know what was happening with him before he came on stage, but whatever it was, he brought it into the music, all of it. Nobody in the audience knew about the phone call. Nobody knew about the piece of paper with the flight information that remained on the corridor table throughout the set. Nobody knew that Baker had made a decision in that backstage corridor that he would spend the rest of his life carrying in the specific way that certain decisions are carried. Not with guilt exactly, and not with indifference, but with the particular awareness of a man who knows that he made the choice his nature required him to make, and who understands, with equal clarity, what that choice cost someone else. He called the hospital after the set, from the phone in Knudsen's office. A nurse told him that his son was stable and that the fever had reduced. He asked to speak with the boy and was told that the boy was sleeping. He left a message. He did not know if the message was delivered or if his son knew, at 6 years old, what a message from a father on the other side of the world meant or did not mean. He set the phone down and sat in Knudsen's office for a while before going back to the corridor where the rhythm section was packing up. Moseholm asked him if everything was all right. Baker said, "My son was in the hospital." Moseholm looked at him. He said, "Was?" Baker said, "He's stable." Moseholm said, "Are you going to him?" Baker looked at him with the expression he wore when he had already decided something and someone was asking him to revisit it. He said, "No." Mosholm said nothing. Baker said, "I had a set to play." Mosholm said, "You played it." Baker said, "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. Then Baker picked up his trumpet case and said goodnight and left. The son recovered. Helema managed the situation with the competence and self-sufficiency that she had developed over 6 years of managing most things alone, and the boy came out of the hospital within a week and returned to the life in Los Angeles that existed entirely separately from Baker's life in Europe. Baker called the hospital once more, 2 days after the Copenhagen set, and was told by Helema that the boy was home and doing well. Baker said that was good. Helema said yes. They spoke for another 2 minutes about nothing consequential, and then ended the call. What the Copenhagen night produced, in addition to the recording that Knudsen made of the set and that was later released as one of Baker's most celebrated live albums, was a permanent alteration in the relationship between Baker and his son. Not an immediate rupture. The relationship had never been close enough to rupture in any dramatic sense. But a solidification of the distance that had always existed, a fixing of it into something that both parties understood, was not going to change. The son grew up knowing that his father had been told he was in the hospital and had played a jazz set in Copenhagen instead of getting on a plane. This knowledge was not kept from him. Helema was not a woman who protected her son from accurate information about the people in his life. The son processed this information the way children process information about absent parents, slowly, incompletely, in ways that took years to become fully visible. In his 50s, the son gave a single interview about his father. He was asked what he remembered most clearly about Chet Baker. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The music. I remember the music first. Everything else came later and made more sense the older I got." He was asked if he was angry. He said, "I used to be. Then I understood that he was what he was, and he couldn't be something else. He played that night because that's what he did. It doesn't mean he didn't. It means he was built a certain way and the building didn't leave room for some things." The interviewer pressed further. He asked, "Did you ever hear the recording from that night?" The son said, "Yes." He said, "Many times." The interviewer asked, "What did you feel?" The son was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that the interviewer published in the piece, and that was subsequently quoted in several Baker biographies. He said, "I felt like I understood why he stayed. I didn't forgive it, but I understood it. Because when you hear that recording, you understand that whatever he was doing that night, he was doing it completely. He wasn't somewhere else while he was playing. He was entirely there. And I think being entirely somewhere was the only thing he ever really knew how to do. The hospital was in Los Angeles. The music was in that room in Copenhagen. He went where he could be entirely somewhere. That's the only explanation I ever found that felt true." Chet Baker played his fourth and final night at the Montmartre Jazz House the following evening, fulfilling the engagement completely. Knudsen said it was another exceptional performance. The album, recorded across all 4 nights, was released 2 years later to critical reception that consistently noted the live sessions as among the most revealing documents of Baker's European period. The liner notes did not mention the phone call, or the piece of paper with the flight information, or the decision made in the backstage corridor on the 3rd night. They described the music. The music was, as Mosholm had said, extraordinary. It contained, as Baker's music always contained, something that the listener could feel without being able to account for. On the 3rd night's recording, that something is particularly present, denser than usual, more insistent, as if the music is carrying a weight that the playing is just barely managing to bear, and that the bearing is somehow the most important part of what is being expressed. If the story of what Chet Baker chose in a Copenhagen corridor in 1961, and what it cost, and what it produced, stayed with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most honest accounts of a life include the choices that cannot be justified and cannot be undone, only carried. Have you ever made a decision that defined you in ways you couldn't fully see at the time? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to explore more stories about the musicians who gave everything to the music and navigated, with varying degrees of success, everything else.